The Career Accelerator lecture was started in the fall of 2020. The Engineering Advisory Board for the School of Engineering wanted to develop a new initiative that would help you make more progress, faster progress towards the career that you want to have. A career accelerator event. And so this was a part of that, which was bring in senior folks that have been through the cave, been where you are, been in your chair, gone on and had successful careers in business and academia and startup, and come back and share what helped them be successful. What recommendations do they have for you? What pitfalls can you avoid? Things like that. And we've had great lectures on all kinds of stuff, ranging from personal finance to continued lifelong learning, to leadership and communication. And we're very excited today to have Matt Peters with us. And before I introduce him, just a little bit on the rules of the road and how this works, if you haven't been with us. So Matt's going to speak. I'll introduce him, he'll speak. Then when he's done in 30, 40 minutes, then we'll have questions. And we encourage you to ask questions. What do you want to know? And we'll share and go till about 5 o'clock. So that's the plan. Let me introduce Matt. Matt Peters graduated from KU in 1997 with a Bachelor of Science in Computer Engineering. He's worked at a series of startups in Silicon Valley focusing on network and cybersecurity. In 2008, he joined Checkpoint Software, where he led technical teams focusing on network security and data analytics. In 2012, he joined Mandiant, a company focused on thwarting nation-state-led cyber attacks. He eventually rose to the position of Vice President of Worldwide Managed Services. In 2016, he joined the founding team of the cybersecurity company Expel, where he served as Chief Technology Officer, building out the engineering and operations functions, and then as Chief Product Officer, eventually growing the company to over 500 people and $1 billion valuation. He is now the CEO and co-founder of the V Group, an IT services company. Please welcome Matt Peters. And one more thing.
All right, well, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And I do also want to thank Bob and Amy and Arvin for getting me here. I will say when I came here this morning, I had a reserved parking space, and I think I couldn't decide which was a bigger honor, the reserved parking space or my diploma from the School of Engineering in 1997. I think it's kind of a dead heat right now, so that's how you know you've arrived. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through a little bit of what I learned here and what life taught me about what I learned here as sort of a general thing, and so we'll see how that goes. I got a bit of an introduction, but I thought I would tell you a little bit more about me. So I did graduate in 1997, which means I'm old. And I ended up going to the Valley pretty soon after that. The first internet boom was wild and in swing, so it was a pretty interesting time to be in Silicon Valley. And so I learned how to work at startups. If you ever decide to work at a startup, you just need to know it's a 24/7 kind of a thing. You just start working and you don't stop until you either make it or you go out of business, and that's just how that works, right? It was really interesting. It was a great time to be there. It had this tremendous frenetic energy, and so I really learned a bunch about how to figure out things on my own and how to do engineering in the real world, which was really kind of cool. From there, at about 2001, the internet bubble popped, and I ended up finding myself working at a slightly larger company. And there, instead of learning how to do startups, instead of learning about how to do tech, I then learned how to build products. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot more that goes into building technology and then getting it out to a mass market, to getting it out to customers and actually helping customers solve problems. And so I learned how to do that, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. About 2008, something really interesting happened in my career, which is I left doing purely technical work and I became a manager, right? And like, if you would talk to me when I was in your seats and said I was going to be a manager, I would have been like, oh God, no, kill me now, right? Like, because I mean, that's like the pleated khakis and the, we're going to need that TPS report in triplicate kind of a thing. But I started to manage teams, and so I learned a bunch over the next couple of years about how to lead people, like how to manage a team, how to grow people. And there's a set of skills around that. So when I talk, I'm going to end up probably spending a little bit more time talking about people. And then this is obscured here, but the last thing in about 2016, I ended up in leadership positions. I ended up as a VP, I ended up as a C-level, and so I learned a bunch about leadership in that, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Now, this isn't about credentialing or saying, wow, I've had a lot of good experiences. Oh, back up, Larry. No problem.
Didn't mean to do that.
It's about telling you something, which is when I graduated in 1997, I was one of the first cohort that learned C++, okay? It was cutting edge, right? I was pretty awesome. I left here knowing C++, the internet was just starting to be a thing, and when I was trying to come up with this talk, I was thinking to myself, like, my God, that is all so quaint, you know? Like, does anyone use MATLAB anymore? Like, really, you know? And I was thinking about this because at the same time I think about all that weird dated tech, and like this will happen to each and every one of you, I promise you, is you'll go back and look at pictures of yourself and go like, why did anyone let me have that haircut, and what am I working on? What is that computer I'm working on? But what I realized was, even though all of that technology was really quaint, there was something about things I had learned and people I'd worked with that really taught me something about like engineering. So like if I work in a team, I can identify in that team who has gone to engineering school, who has an engineering background. And I couldn't tell why, but I just knew that there was something about engineers in particular that made them identifiable to me, so in a team project. So I went to the smartest person I know, which is my wife, and I asked her about it, and she and I were dating. It's adorable. She and I were dating when I was going to engineering school, and she said that she watched over 4 years, it changed the way I thought. Right? Like that was the thing that she took away. And so I've thought about that a lot. And so what I've done in this talk is sort of unpacked a little bit about what engineering taught me about how to think and how that's affected my career path to date. So the first thing to call out is I didn't start out at KU as an engineering major. I didn't come in knowing how to program. I didn't like math. I actually joined as a sociology major, which was kind of odd. I supped at the vase of Hegel's historical dialectic. Like that's what I was interested in. I was interested in like reading about history, things like this. But at one point, I built my own computer. And if you've ever done something like that before, I got bitten by the bug, right? Like that. I sort of like, I love computers, and I was fascinated by getting this sort of stuff to work. And so I joined up. And I remember walking into my first engineering class and feeling like the world's biggest imposter because I'm not good at math. Right? I spent 4 years expecting somebody to go, what are you doing here? You're a sociology major, get out, right? But one of the things it taught me was how to work hard, right? Because I wasn't good at math to start with. I remember in particular a specific moment. There was a professor, Don Doherty, and he taught our circuits class. Who's in EECS here? EECS? Represent. Do they still have a circuits class about midway through? Is it still a giant goat rodeo? Is it tough? Yeah. So I went and I was really struggling in circuits, and every class when I would start to struggle, I would think like, this is it. This is when I discover I'm not really gonna make it as an engineer. Like that was what was on my shoulders. And I went in to talk to Don Doherty, and he was like, look, here's the real deal. You're gonna have to keep working at it. At some point you're gonna get it, it's gonna snap, but you just have to wait, you have to give it that time, and you have to hope for two things. One, that happens, and two, it happens before the end of the semester, because right now you're not doing so well. And so I was like, okay, all right, pro tip, okay. And so I did. I went and I worked a lot. Late at night, I worked problems. I did them over and over again. And then I can vividly remember the moment where there used to be a restaurant called the Village Inn. I believe the health code violations finally shut it down. But I would work there late at night. And I remember sitting there staring at a circuit. And I can remember the moment where the light went off. And I was like, oh. I can still do a circuit today. Like I could still do one if you asked me to, because the light bulb went off, and I was like, okay, yeah, no, maybe I'm gonna make it. But the thing that I learned in that moment is that I had a mental model in my head of X amount of brains equals Y amount of results. You're an engineer, you're not, right? Look around and everybody's smart and they're gonna figure it out. That was the wrong model. What Don Doherty taught me was it's X amount of brains times Y amount of effort equals some amount of result, right? And if you aren't getting it, work harder. Right? You don't have to like work yourself to death, but the idea is that there's a certain amount of struggle I have to do sometimes to access the figuring it out, and I learned how to do that here at KU, and that's paid off tremendously in various things where I hit something new. 25-year engineering career, I hit new things all the time, and when I don't get them at first, I don't run away from it. I go, okay, we're gonna buckle down, we're gonna figure this out. I know I'm gonna get to the aha. I know it, I just need to give it a minute. So that was the first thing I learned. The second thing that I learned in engineering school was kind of an interesting pattern, and this is something that engineers do that's kind of cool. The difference between engineers and scientists, anybody know? I'll give it to you. Engineers solve problems, scientists find new problems, okay? And that's not to like throw a rock at scientists. I couldn't do that big brain creativity. But like when I'm solving problems, the thing that engineering school taught me was a bunch of tools on how to think about them. So one of the best ones was if I have a problem that I don't know how to solve, how to turn it into a problem I do know how to solve, right? So for any of you who have taken that circuits class and you've watched somebody take some giant circuit and simplify it down to an RLC thing, or you take a system and you make it simpler. So a good example of this, I was the founding team of this company called Expel, and one of the things that we were trying to do was we were trying to figure out a way to fundamentally make people more effective at dealing with security problems, right? The world was awash in these sort of attackers. The attackers were very advanced, and we were just generally, like industry had failed to solve this problem of making it so that someone could defend their own network. And everybody was trying to think about it like, oh, well, if you gave them more of this or more of this, but they kept thinking with a security lens on. And so I sat down, I remember sitting down with our then CTO, and I said, okay, but like fundamentally what we're trying to do is we're trying to get people to be able to make good, high quality, high intensity decisions quickly. That's what we're trying to do. Does anybody else do that? And I was like, well, air traffic controllers do, travel agents do, customer tech support does. And when I started thinking about it as problems that other people had solved, I all of a sudden saw the problem differently. And oh, we can solve the problem now. It's not a security problem. It's a decision support problem. I learned here how to take problems I don't know how to solve and turn them into problems I can. The image here, by the way, I don't know if you guys still joke about this, but like we would do math problems where they'd be like, just assume a horse is a sphere or whatever, you know, like that kind of assumption. But these kinds of things to translate a problem from an unsolvable domain into a solvable domain. And if you can figure out the right assumptions to make, it becomes amazingly powerful. And that was one of the things that ended up allowing Expel to do what it did, was because we stopped trying to solve the problem the hard way, and we actually solved the problem the right way, which was kind of useful. So I now know where my EECS comrades are. So you'll recognize the thing on the bottom. The thing on the top, if you're not familiar, hopefully you are, hopefully you still have Math 250, is the infamous Wellmixed tanks in series. Okay, and so you know, if you've dealt with these things before, I will counsel you. I have been an engineer professionally for 25 years. As Bob might have mentioned, I was reasonably successful. I have literally never professionally had to solve an RLC circuit or tell anybody what the solution was in either one of those tanks. It's just never happened. So if you're worried that your career will be an unending series of well-mixed tanks, it will not. Okay, so everyone can relax about that. But I will tell you this, I've used these, as much as I hated learning them, every single day of my career for 25 years, right? Which is weird to say because I've never actually solved one of these things. But what I thought about when I put this slide together was knowing how to figure out the solution in either one of those tanks, or knowing how to figure out using Kirchhoff's laws, the current or the voltage or anything like that. Those are facts, right? And they're not teaching you facts here, they're teaching you skills, right? And the skill that they're really teaching you here is dynamic systems and the ability to think about dynamic systems. And if you can master that while you're here, I will tell you it is an absolute superpower, right? Because I never do solve RLC circuits, but I'll tell you what I do all the time is when I'm starting a company, I sit down and I tell investors, hey, in 2.5 years, we're gonna be here, we're gonna be burning this much money, and this is how many people we need to do it. And what that effectively is the change in a system over time, right? And the fact that I can think about things like that is hugely useful, right? So one of the things that was really interesting, again, while we were solving the problems at Expel, was that the investors, and this is an unfortunate place to be in sometimes, didn't believe we could solve the problem that we were saying we could solve. They didn't believe us. And so we ended up having to, 5 years ahead of time, come up with a model for like, okay, this is how much this is gonna cost to do, and this is what's gonna happen, and this is how fast we're gonna be able to do the work. And the key thing was our ability to sit down and say, okay, well, this is how fast the work is now, and we're gonna make these improvements over the next 4 years, and so this is how fast it's gonna be then. That system level understanding was what ended up allowing us to, A, convince the investors, but B, actually build a system, okay? So when you're thinking about this, when you're thinking about the well-mixed tank, or when you're thinking about the RLC circuit, obviously you need to solve them for the test, so you do. Like there are facts that are important, I'm not saying there are not, but the thing that you should think about whenever you're learning anything in engineering school is, what are they actually trying to teach me? Right? Because there's something that's going to be useful. I don't do engineering anymore. I got a buddy, he's actually my quintessential, like whenever I was feeling bad about being an engineer, I would always look over at my buddy who is a real engineer, and he went through Rice and he got an engineering degree and he went off and he did undersea robotics. That's what he does. Even now, he doesn't do robotics. He doesn't do what we would call engineering. He does what we would normally call like management. He thinks about budget and like, you know, quality assurance and things like this. But all of the tools that he learned about how to think about dynamic systems come into play in that moment in a way that's like kind of uniquely engineering, right? this is one of the things whenever I'm in a meeting with people and I see people able to do this, I'm usually like, did you go to an undergraduate program? What was it in? It's almost always engineering. Like it's something about engineering and the way you think about it that gets you here. So think about not the facts that they're trying to teach you, but think about the skills they're trying to give you. Now, there are some math things that are useful. I will say that most of the things that are on this screen were much harder to do when I was here, and I'm not playing an uphill both ways in the snow kind of game. I'm just saying mathematical thinking is a superpower. Okay? And I'm not talking about the ability to do math, right? I don't ever calculate root mean squared error. I just don't. It doesn't come up, right? But what I can do is I can look at an equation and I can see, oh, well, if that gets bigger, this is what's going to happen. Oh, if that changes, this is what's going to happen, okay? That comes into play a lot. Being able to have a couple tools in your back pocket, like, oh, I can do linear regression, I understand it. You don't have to be able to do it, like, go get Jupyter Notebooks. Jupyter Notebooks knows how to do it. As long as you understand what you're doing and when to apply it, it will be a superpower. That will be, you will show up to the meeting being like, well, boss, I've already predicted where the product's gonna go next year because of this. And here's the R squared, because you're gonna be fancy, right? Like that's the actual superpower. If you have a couple of clustering algorithms that if you know how to do data analysis. So a number of years ago, I was at a company and they had just done their first employee survey, like employee satisfaction survey, which was cool, it was good, kudos to them, but nobody knew how to look at the data. They were just like, okay, well, we got these survey results now, what do we do? And so I was like, why don't you give them to me, just give me the spreadsheet and I'll do something with them. And I ended up doing a whole bunch of just basic like correlation analysis, this sort of stuff, like the kinds of things that you learn in your basic stats class, and came back and said, hey, this is what it tells us. Amazing, okay? The other thing this lets you do is it lets you look at things mathematically and pull away a lot of the extraneous details. So a number of years ago, we were looking at a particular problem. There's a room full of people, and the graph of the problem, there was a cost. It was a human process, and the graph of the cost was going like that. And everybody was freaking out. They were like, that cost is unacceptable. We're all going to lose our jobs. I mean, it was panic time. And I looked at it and I was like, well, yeah, I mean, there's a feedback loop in there. Like, how do you know that? Like, because that's a graph of x squared. And x squared got to be a feedback loop, something multiplied by itself. That's what it is, right? How do I know that? Because I know math, right? Went in and sure enough, right in the middle of that process, there was a feedback. They were like, he's a genius. No. I just knew what x squared looked like, okay? Mathematical thinking is incredibly powerful if you use it right. Okay? So don't neglect that, but again, it's not facts, it's a skill. So, funny side story. Does anyone recognize a Shuart control chart? How many of you people know what a Shuart control chart is? Arvin, we're gonna talk after this, man. Okay, so years ago, when they first started building telephone switches, they buried them in the ground, right? And it was very, very expensive to dig them up to fix them. And so they had to figure out something about quality control. So there's this guy named Shuart, and what he said was, hey, if we measure certain things about the building of the switches, then we can go ahead and decide whether or not the building is working well. So we'll measure how many wraps there are, we'll measure how many failures there are in certain tests and things like this. And so what he did was he came up with this thing, it's called a Shuart control chart. And basically what he does is he just says, count a thing, and then over time measure it relative to its standard deviation, right? And that, like the lines there are just relative to a standard deviation. The key thing is it was something that somebody could do with paper and pencil. Now you can just do it automatically. And if you say the word standard deviation, just pro tip, you sound brilliant in a meeting. So like just pepper it through. Like as you're professionally meeting with people, just be, well, obviously the coefficient of variation, and everyone just be like, oh, they know what they're talking about. But in this case, knowing how to measure things and knowing like how to do it well is again another superpower, because you can take that and apply that anywhere. There is nothing you're going to work on in your professional life that anyone pays money for that at the end of it they aren't going to want some sort of measurement of. That's just the way the world works. And so being able to look and say, this is how I take a good measurement and this is how I know whether or not the measurement is still legit is actually a really important thing to be able to do. It doesn't have to be a Shuart control chart. This is just a nifty sort of history thing. How many people have heard of Six Sigma, by the way? Six Sigma? Okay, that's all. Six Sigma is just a Shuart control chart with the sixth standard deviation, just as a side note. They like to think it's very fancy, but take that, Jack Welch. Anyway, so at the end of the day, being able to measure is a huge thing, and the ability to understand what your measurements mean is kind of key, and I learned how to do that here at engineering school. All right, so now we transition. I left engineering school in 1997. knowing a ton of stuff. Oh, it was so good. I was going to the Valley. Engineers were in high demand. And there's a downside here with this, which is in engineering, oftentimes when you enter the workforce, you will have slightly more recent experience than the people who are hiring you. And this is the way it works in the professional world, is you will go work for a company, and you'll work with whatever their tech stack is for some number of years, and technology will change and improve, and you'll be kind of out of the loop, and then you'll go get a new job, and you'll be like, and you'll go and then have to like change your tech stack. So that can fool you into thinking that you know more than the people who are out there. Let me just take a second and disabuse you of that notion. So there's a couple of things. I have interviewed literally hundreds of people at this point in my career. I've been a hiring manager for dozens of positions. And there's three things that we look for when we hire people, okay? The first one is skills, right? Can you do math? Can you think mathematically? Are you a system thinker? You know, that sort of stuff. The second is traits. That's the stuff you walked in here with. I'm resilient. I'm creative. I'm a team player. Those are traits. That's where you go to when things are stressful, right? And the last is experience. And that's the thing you're not walking out of here with, right? You're not going to walk out with a lot of experience. Don't worry about it, because you're going to walk out with a lot of skills and a lot of really good traits if you focus on those, right? Experience is the thing that you gain over years and years of doing something. At this point, if I go into an operations situation, I just know what to do. I've done it so many times at this point. I'm like, oh yeah, this, right? Everybody here would struggle with that because you've never done it before. You build experience over time, right? The curve here, everyone familiar with the Dunning-Kruger, I hope, okay? Yes. So what this effectively is it's very easy when you don't know a hell of a lot. You have some skills and people around you are going, oh yeah, well we don't know how to program in C++ or whatever. That's fine, but if they've been doing the same thing for 20 years, they probably know a lot about it, right? And so understanding like how much there is to learn there is kind of important, right? The key lesson I learned, and I will be honest with you and say I didn't learn it immediately, right, is to value everybody you meet along your journey, because every single one of them is going to tell you something you didn't know. Every one of them has a path and an experience and a set of traits and skills that you don't have. And so valuing that, one of the things that I thought was so interesting, early on, is when I ended up getting one of my first jobs, and it was a job where we were working in a manufacturing plant, like we had a manufacturing plant attached to the facility. And the CEO at one point sort of gave a talk, and he was like, hey, so early on in my career, one of the things I realized was it was a really good idea as you're building stuff to go talk to the people on the factory floor who are assembling it, because they will tell you things you don't know about how your thing is really working, how hard it is to put together, that sort of stuff, right? It's a really, really useful, I never would have thought of that, right? So there's a ton of stuff that you can learn as long as you understand that you don't know everything, and that's hard to do sometimes, particularly when you're young. I remember what it was like to be young, and I was like, oh, just gonna get out there. And I'm not saying you don't know stuff, so don't take that. The other thing is when you're sitting here and you're thinking about the mountain of going and getting a job and how terrifying that is, you're gonna get a job. You're going to build that experience, and at some point, you're going to wake up and you realize you look really old, and you're going to be here, not there. It's all going to work out. All right, so that's sort of the shtick right there. So I was in college, as the introduction indicated, in '97. This movie, Apollo 13, came out in 1998. How many people have seen this movie? Oh, thank God. Okay, good. All right. So how many people thought the engineers were the heroes in the movie? Oh, yeah, I mean, represent. Okay, of course they were. So one of the things that's so interesting about this film, though, is our entire space program was built on a chain of failures, right? Turns out failure is an option, right? And actually, Ed Harris in this photo, he's playing Gene Kranz, who is the head of mission control. If you ever get a chance, read Gene Kranz's autobiography. It's called Failure's Not an Option. And you will realize just what a goat rodeo the American space program really was, right? When they had their first launch out of Langley, they had a rocket that was full of liquid fuel, and it was just like it was like a 2-liter pop bottle can. It's full of fuel, and that's what makes it rigid. And the rocket didn't go off, okay? They had no way to get the fuel out, and they didn't know. They were like, well, we expected the rocket to launch, and now we've got this giant tank of fuel. What are we gonna do? So I kid you not, somebody went home to get a rifle, and their plan was to shoot at it until it blew up. Like that was NASA, right? Like that's a thing, right? The other story that I love about this is when in 1961, when they were gonna launch the first man into ballistic orbit, that was Alan Shepard. They had so many mistakes and screw-ups during the countdown that it took like 7 hours. And they hadn't planned on him being in there for more than 20 minutes, and he had to go to the bathroom. So he ended up just having to pee in his pants. So the first man in ballistic orbit from the United States went around with pee in his pants. Now, the thing is, like as engineers, take a second to realize like nobody was jazzed about that, right? They weren't. But when they got him back, they said like, hey, let's make a list of all the things we did wrong and let's make sure those don't happen again. That's engineering, right? Like, and so the key thing that I learned about engineering was it wasn't so much that you weren't going to have failures. I have had some pretty catastrophically amazing failures in my time. It's a question of I learn real quickly from those failures and then I try to make sure they don't happen again. And part of my job, if I'm a good engineer, is I try to control the cost of those failures. So a really good example of this, I was listening to this interview with one of the guys who's a head engineer for the software on the European Space Agency, and they were launching a probe. And the issue that he ran into was they weren't going to be able to finish the software before the rocket launched, right? Awkward, right? So what they did was they said, we're only going to work on one thing and we're going to get it absolutely perfectly, and that is the software to upgrade the software. That's it. Because then we can do whatever we want. Right? They lowered the cost of failure because now if they screw up the software as they're building the rocket, they can just upgrade it. That's fine. It's great. And so one of the things I learned working in startups in Silicon Valley, working in technology, I built dozens of products at this point, is the key thing to do is figure out when failure is the least costly and make sure you're failing then, make sure you learn those lessons, and then make sure you're not failing when it's going to cost you a lot of money, right? Because there are times when it will, and you don't want to do that. So that's a kind of a lesson that I learned here, but didn't really learn until I was in the professional life. I think here we focus a lot on getting the right answer on the test. And when you get out there, you realize, oh yeah, actually there's not a right answer. There's like the best answer and the least wrong one. So how many people became an engineer because you like to build stuff? How many people became an engineer because you like to blow things up? Show of hands. Asking for a friend. Oh yeah, no, I see you. So I like to build things too, right? Like it's actually one of the reasons I built a computer. It was one of the reasons I got here. I love making software, okay? A couple of years ago, I ended up renting a car from a car rental agency that will remain nameless for the purposes of this discussion. But I remember I walked up to a kiosk, not entirely unlike these kiosks, and I was like, okay, fair enough. Like we've removed the human from this. We're all faceless in late stage capitalism. I'm good with it, okay? I'm gonna rent this car, I'm gonna get on my way. And so I walk up to the kiosk, I press the button, and all of a sudden it becomes a Zoom session and there's a person on the other side with headphones talking to me. And I'm like, oh my God, you have managed to single-handedly capture both of the worst parts of this experience because I neither wanted to talk to a human or interact with your crappy technology. She couldn't hear me, I couldn't hear her. It was the most frustrating thing in the world. And so in that moment, I realized like what had happened here was an engineer got what I refer to as a case of the clevers. And they're like, you know what we can do is we can use some technology to fix a problem that isn't there. Because if I check out through the normal person process, it takes a few minutes. I'm not a huge fan, but I'll do it. If I check out the technology process, okay, fair enough, but man, they managed to combine the things, right? When you're an engineer, when you're a practicing engineer, try to solve a problem that actually exists, okay? And when you do it, try to only use technology if you have to. Right? I remember I do security operations, so a lot of what we do is move quickly, like we have to move with alacrity, as we like to say, because someone's being attacked, okay? And I remember we had this conversation, the engineers were gonna put a whole bunch of timing into the application so they made it faster, and the ops people would know, and all this sort of stuff, and I was like, I don't know, what if I just buy a stopwatch? About $7, right? You can build your $3 million program, or you can just $7. And we bought stopwatches. I mean, that's how you do that. Like, you don't always have to write software. You don't always have to build a thing. There are times when you can just talk to the people, and they'll be like, oh yeah, no, we could just do this instead. So make sure you're solving a real problem, okay? And make sure that you're not just building a thing because it's cool, right? That's a hard lesson. There's a lot of dollars on my side of that ledger. So the other thing, and this was hard because like, I got into technology and I joke about this like, I say nobody ever goes into engineering because they like dealing with people, right? Like that's not why I was here, right? I'm not a people person. Another lecturer for this series though, I think Alan Mullally might have come and given a speech. So he was the CEO of Ford Motor Company, transferred over from Boeing, turned that company around. If you ever get a chance, I would suggest read his corporate biography. It's called American Icon. And one of the things that you'll be interested, like if you read it like I did, the aha I had was he almost never mentions anything technical. All he talks about is his team. All he talks is his people. He talks about his customers. He talks about going out and like being at a dealership, okay? One of the things that I've learned, right, is I've learned that people are at the center of every single thing I do. I could get the technology absolutely right, and we might still not succeed because there's people in there. Similarly, I could get the technology almost completely wrong, but the people might save me. So an example of this, I was at a company called Extreme Networks, and we built, I probably should not say that for legal reasons, but anyway, we built a wireless product. And the first iteration of the wireless product, this was back in the day. Remember, I'm old, so back before Wi-Fi was ubiquitous, Nobody had it. It was next generation. It was a great time to be alive. And we built this product. It was new in the industry, and we were way out ahead. We had better encryption than everybody. Security was better, that sort of stuff. And it just wasn't selling at all. And I was so disappointed. Part of the skunk works. I was really jazzed. We were there. We had like shirts with logos. And the product just wasn't selling. And so I remember I was at the cafeteria and I bumped into one of the salespeople and I was like, can you just explain to me what the hell's going on? Right? Like what's up? And he's like, well, think about this for a second. We have been selling layer 2 switches for 10 years. Nobody here knows anything about wireless. You've given us this thing, and now what am I going to go do? Am I going to go talk to a customer about something I don't know anything about? And I was like, you make a fair point. We have missed a step here. Maybe we should spend a little time explaining to the rest of our company what we have built. And so me and a couple of the folks from the QA team put together a whole lab. We made contests. We had the sales engineers come in. We trained them up. Sales through the roof, right? Because at the end of the day, the success wasn't in the technology. The technology could be the best thing in the world. People are at the center of it. The second thing to keep in mind is that people are affected by everything you do, right? So if you build a thing and it's tissue paper thin and it jets oil all over wherever, like that's kind of on you, right? Like you've got to make sure that you understand like the implications back and forth of this thing. But at the end of the day, it's people doing people stuff with people things, and there happens to be a little technology involved. And if you keep that in mind, at least my experience has been, everything you do will be that much more successful. This one's probably not going to be popular. So at the end of the day, ChatGPT is a thing, right? And so I'm sure, how many people have used ChatGPT in the room? How many have used it on an assignment asking for a friend? Oh, every hand went down. Okay, good. Well played. Okay, so when I was here, the guy who taught programming was a guy named Kostas Satsoulis. I don't remember, is he at Purdue or something like this? I don't remember where he is now. Okay. So Kostas had us doing, for our intro programming class, he required that we write an engineering format report for every project we did. And I hated it. I hated him for it. I was like, oh my God, this is the worst. All I want to do is write the software. I'm slanging code here, okay? But here's the thing I will tell you right now, the single biggest investment you can make in your career is learn how to write well. If you take one thing away from this lecture, take that, right? Don't use ChatGPT, right? Learn how to do it yourself, and the reason for that is twofold, okay? The first one is, as an engineer, often the only product you will produce is a document, right? I will tell you now as an executive who consumes a lot of engineering consultants' work, if I get a report and it is badly written, I have a problem, right? I'm not jazzed about that. Writing well is a huge thing. But the second thing is not to get into the whole Whorf-Sapir linguistic hypothesis issue, but to say you think in language. And the better that you write, the more clearly you will think. I assure you that this is the case. My experience is the best way to get better at writing is to read a lot, right? And don't read crap, right? I put up Strunk and White's Elements of Style because one, it's a really good style book, but E.B. White has written some of the best essays in English. And so it would be worthwhile to maybe grab that and take a look at some. But at the end of the day, whatever it is you do, whatever it is you have to do, get better at writing now because it's one of the skills that will serve you forever, right? The amount of benefit I've gotten by being able to just sit down and say, so I'll give you a good example of this. One of the companies I worked for, we did, I think it was mentioned in the introduction, we dealt with nation-state threat actors. Does everybody know what that is? Okay, if you are in a company, if you don't, if you are in a company and a government decides to attack your company because they want to steal your intellectual property, we would come and help you. Okay? To say that that is a stressful moment would be the world's biggest understatement. Okay? And at one point in one of these situations, something had happened and something had gone wrong, right? Just through the natural course of things. And I had to write an email to the person we were facing, whose company was, going down, whose job was on the line, to sort of explain what had happened. And if you think in that moment ChatGPT would be a good bet, you'd be wrong. In that moment, you want to pick your words carefully. You want to express, hey, something's gone wrong. Here's the situation. I feel for you. I'm right there. We're there for you. Every single word in that email counted, right? And it was only because I had spent time figuring out how to write well that I was able to pull that off. And it was kind of funny because the people who were involved in the count came to me and they're like, well, just could you please write it and we'll send it. Write whatever, we'll send whatever. It's a skill. Build it now because you have time now. Don't try to build it on the job. That's a hard one to do, okay? So I recommend it. Strunk and White's Elements of Style. Run, don't walk. So how many people are familiar with the Challenger disaster? Most hackneyed failure. So I will just say one thing about that. So the And it's been talked about a lot, but one of the things that happened in that was that there's a contractor called Morton Thiokol who's responsible for the O-rings that actually failed during the disaster and caused the destruction of the shuttle. When they were doing their internal reporting, when the engineer was trying to explain to people above him that doing this in sub-zero weather is a bad idea, the graph he used was terrible, okay? Go Google it at some point, you can pull up the thing. I could look at that graph and make the wrong call. Okay? The thing, and not to blame this engineer because there were plenty of other failures and there was a ton of analysis that was done post facto, but to say that one of the problems that we have as engineers is that we believe that technical details matter and they're the only thing that matter. Okay? I'll tell you right now that you're going to end up in a meeting at some point and you're going to have all the details, you're going to have all the facts, and you're going to show up and you're going to be like, okay, well, ... and you're going to look at it and a sea of blank faces. And then they're either going to ignore you, right? Or they're going to talk around you, or they're going to ask you some question that frustrates you. And that is not their failure. It will be yours, right? Because most of the time when you're in the room and you are the engineer, you're in charge of the technical details and everybody else is responsible for other stuff. And your job is to make them successful, not the other way around. And so one of the things I learned very quickly was if I need to make my project successful, if I need to make my boss understand, if I need to get a group of people to understand what's going wrong with this thing, I have to figure out a way to talk to them in language they understand, not the other way around, right? So if you think about that, it would be very worthwhile to think about whenever you're talking to somebody, okay, what does this person do? What do they know? How much do they know, right? And let me try to figure out if I can get it the closest to them that I can. Don't try to make them approach you, you approach them. It's easiest to do it that way. If you can do this, it is an absolute superpower. Right? Because this is the way that you go in front of a big room of people and you tell them what the plan is. Because you've got people from marketing and you have people from sales and you have people from engineering and you have people from operations and you talk about the plan at a level that they are all nodding along with. That is a superpower. So try now to adapt it. If nothing else, understand that the technical details are often the least important thing. Okay? Because most of the time other people won't understand them and they'll just confuse the issue. So figure out how to summarize at the right level. It's a huge thing. The subtle power of being able to tell a joke in a meeting. As a fun side note, I used to tell a boss of mine that I only have one job skill, and that's I can tell a joke in a meeting, right? So I'll tell you two stories about this. So the first one's kind of a funny one. I was working for a company, and something had gone badly south, right? And it was a technology that this company absolutely depended on, and it was about, well, let me just think. It was December 21st. I happen to remember exactly because it was a couple days before Christmas, and this customer was in Canada, and some of these things were deployed in the Arctic Circle, right? And so it had gone badly, and he needed a fix. So we got on the phone with this guy, and I remember he yelled at us for 45 minutes. Yelled. I'm not talking about like a crisp conversation. I'm talking about he yelled at us for 45 minutes. Now, before we getting on this call, the company had told us, this guy is a huge customer. We have done terribly by him. Your job is to sort this out, right? So there's no walking away from this one. And so here I am sitting there, and I tried to do my we're going to decompress the situation, deconflict. And so I came off mute, and I'm like, I don't know that this is the most productive way to do this. And he's like, son, I'm not done yelling at you yet. And I was like, whoa, okay, all right, keep going. So we're on mute, and my whole team is just sitting there like, oh, kill us now. And I remember at the end of that, my boss, who should have been furious because it was our fault, right, just said, well, I guess we got that going for us, which is nice. And then we figured out how to solve the problem. But everybody laughed, and in that moment, it was like, oh, okay, all right, we're going to be okay, right? Similarly, I had an experience, and I actually didn't remember this, which was interesting until I left my last company. And a woman there wrote me a nice note, and she talked about a project that she was working on that went really badly. I mean, the project was a total disaster. And when you spend a lot of money and then at the very end you have a disaster, obviously people like me show up and they're like, what the hell? But she said, hey, I remember when you came in there, you just sat there and said, I don't care that it's a disaster. I trust you guys are going to fix it. That's not my problem. You guys are smart. You'll get it figured out. I'm just really interested in understanding how we got here because I'd love to know because we're going to do this again at some point, and I'd love to just unpack that a little bit. And she said to me, it really meant a lot that I wasn't out looking to yell at somebody, and she felt much better and more confident about it, trying to solve the problem and then continuing on. I didn't even remember that. So the reason I tell you this is at some point in your career, you might be in a situation where you're right and somebody's wrong, right? And let me tell you that 5 years from that moment, they will not remember whether you were right or wrong, but they will remember how you made them feel, Okay? And if you remember that this is about people doing people stuff with people things, it's hugely important that as we go and present ourselves into the world, we do it in a way that's kind of empowering. I've learned this because I was a person who was very, very happy being right, you know, and wanted to set my heels in and tell people that they were wrong, because engineers, we care about being right and wrong. It does not matter, because if your team is irritated and they're not collaborating, or you've pissed off your customer, that's not gonna help. So at the end of the day, think about the idea that like part of your job is to make sure that like, hey, you're being good in the world. Like we're being good to each other, right? So in that case, subtle power, being able to tell a joke in the meeting. Don't always tell a joke. There are times when the joke is vastly inappropriate. I've also learned that the hard way, so don't always do that. But this is also one, I'm just gonna say, if you do my kind of work, I'm not saying all kinds of work, but being able to present, being able to talk in front of a group of people is a thing that you should work on doing, and you can do it now relatively safely. Group projects, presentations, things like this. How many people like presenting in public? Awesome. Okay, well, lean on them then. But develop some of that skill yourself, because it is actually important to be able to do it. It has been a thing that has held back leaders that I have managed. Their inability to present, their inability to like, you know, share knowledge with a group has caused them sort of like, you know, friction in their careers because they didn't develop the skill early. Again, you're in a position now where, you know, where that can be important, okay? So the last thing I'm gonna call out, and then I guess I'll open up for questions, is the following. So when I was here, I was confident I was gonna be a software engineer. That's what I was gonna do. I like computers. I'm gonna write software. And I would meet people who, I remember specifically, I met this guy who was he was a CFO of a company, and he was like, well, yeah, I have an engineering degree. I got an electrical engineering degree from whatever. And I'm like, and you're a finance guy? Like, what the hell happened to you, right? Like, it's something horrible happened. I'm like, he's a C-level executive, but I'm like, oh, well, something went terribly wrong with his career. There are so many amazing jobs out there that I guarantee you, you've not even heard of before. I remember the first time I launched a product, and we had people in there from ops and marketing and all sorts of different places, and I was like, what do all these people do? Oh my God. And I started talking to them, and I was like, wow, your job is fascinating. So I remember when we were building this wireless product, the marketing guy came in and he's like, I have a strategy for how we're launching this product, and I'd like to talk to you guys about it. And I mean, like, it's a room full of engineers, so to say that we were like, was a little, you know, it was that. And he's like, okay, so we have to launch this product at a trade show. That trade show has to have at least 40,000 people at it. There are 2 of them in our industry. They happen on this date and this date. Then I need 4 big magazine hits, boom, boom, and he laid this whole program out. He had it locked. And then he was like, so I can slide this around if we need to, but I need to know which date. So what date, right? And I was like, wow, like that's a real, there's a whole lot of thought and discipline that goes into marketing. It's a whole thing. One of my other favorite things to do was at one of the companies, at the end of the quarter, we had to ship a lot of stuff, because you'll learn this when you go to work for a publicly traded company, is like the end of the quarter, they have to do a lot of economic stuff because they have to get the thing in under the wire. And so one of the things that would happen is a lot of us would end up at the factory shipping boxes, right? And we wouldn't do the shipping, we'd be there to like do the software and stuff like this, but the number of people, we had people from ops and people from finance and all this sort of stuff, and it was so amazing to see sort of the team effort that went into this. And every single one of those people had a life path that got them to a really interesting job, right? Like every one of you has, right? So the thing to note there is, right now you're learning a bunch of skills. You're learning how to program, or you're learning how to solve, you know, structural equations or do dimensional analysis or whatever it is, right? You have some traits, you came in with them, you'll sharpen some along the way, right? But don't let those skills and traits be like a prison for what you can build, the experience you can gain. Like go out there and talk to people and be like, oh yeah, that sounds like a really interesting idea. Some of you are gonna end up in marketing and it's gonna be amazing. Some of you are gonna leave the field of engineering and maybe become lawyers. That's also gonna be cool, right? So just be open to that, because I think one of the things that I did early on was sort of blinded myself to how many amazing things there were that weren't immediately linked to the technical work, but there have been so many things that I've learned along the way and so many things I've gotten to do because over the time that experience built out. So that's that. Thank you so much for coming to my TED Talk.
Questions?
So currently you're with the B Group, you're the CEO and co-founder of that, which is, I'm guessing, a really big IT services company. How often do you guys use AI and other kind of like artificial practices?
Okay, the question is, how often do you use AI and
Yep.
other artificial practices?
Okay, fair enough. And I have to, just sort of for moral purposes, tell you that the B group is a code name for the company that we had to use to incorporate. No one is going to do business with a company called the B group because it sounds too close to the B team. So we're renaming it. Let's just be clear on that. So in terms of how often do we use AI, at the B group, we literally founded that company a week ago, right? Like that's my 5th startup. So right now we use AI precisely never. But our plan is to actually there's a couple of places that we're using it. The thing I will say, though, is at every one of my jobs, we've used some class of machine learning, some class of what you might think of as AI. But in this particular way, and this is a thing I actually feel really strongly about, one of the problems that we have in technology is that people tend to discover 5 grams of unobtainium. With AI or ML, we'll take over the universe, And then they load it in the shotgun and they fire it at whatever problem they have, and oftentimes it just ends very poorly. One of the things that we did at Expel very, very intentionally was we identified very specific problems where we could apply this sort of stuff. When I think about ML, for instance, it's basically a way to allow a computer to help you make more nonlinear decisions. If you think about it that way, you can apply it to a very particular decision I need to make. I can make a computer do that for me. I can't make a computer do anything for me. It's just not useful. So at the B group, we're planning on using conversational models for the purpose of helping scale out a particular type of interaction, right? But that's a very targeted use of it. Did I get to where you were trying to go?
Yes.
Okay.
Other questions?
Come on now. Do it.
What would you say one of your greatest failures was in your career, and how did you learn from it?
The question is, what is one of the greatest failures in your career, and what did you learn from it?
Is it a bad sign that I have so many to choose from? Okay. All right, I will tell you a technical failure I had, and then I will tell you a leadership failure I had. How about that? So I was working on a product that did optical networking. So think back when, optical fiber and stuff like this and the switches that routed phone calls. Basically, I was working on those switches, okay? And one of the issues that we ended up having was there was like consumer equipment that could talk over certain bands and like the network equipment that could talk over other bands. And there was a very small overlap between those two bands. And when I was programming the software, I just didn't keep track of which bands those were. And so the first time we deployed, they just couldn't talk. And remember when I mentioned how expensive failure is? If you screw up on phone switches, it costs a lot of money to fix that sort of stuff. And so in this case, like unwinding that decision was like kind of difficult and very embarrassing because it was just a dumb decision. It's basically like, so you couldn't tell the difference between a 0 and a 1. So I had to fly out to a place, and we were just in a test lab at the time, so thank God. But it's still like, it smarted a bit as a thing. I learned out of that to always test the stuff first, right? Figure out some way to disambiguate the risk by coming up with a test case, coming up with some way to try it out, that sort of stuff. And that was one of the things that I learned out of that. So that was my one there. Leadership failure. I will tell you, one of the things that happens when you get this much gray in your hair is that the people that work for you sometimes, you talk like this, right? So I had a young engineer working for me, and he wanted to automate a particular thing. And we did that particular thing precisely never. But he was really interested in this type of technology, and so he and I, went back and forth. And I was just like, look, we never do this. Automating it, it's a dumb idea, this kind of thing. And what I didn't do at that time, because I was the leader and it's my job to give in that case, is I didn't sit down and say, okay, what is actually keeping him from understanding me, and what am I not understanding from him? So one of the things that you should do, I learned in that moment, is whenever you're talking to someone smart and you're disagreeing with them, the question you should ask is not, why don't you understand me? Or what the hell are you missing? The question you should ask is, okay, help me see what you see, right? Help me get on your side of the table. And I didn't do that in that moment because at the end of the day, I was convinced I was right. And how many people have been wrong before? How did you feel right before you discovered you were wrong? Yeah, that's exactly the situation I found myself in. I was mortally confident I was right, and so I was gonna hold on to this. And what I should have done is been like, no, hang on a second. You're a really smart person. You know a bunch of stuff I don't know. I don't know what it is. Help me get there. And so that was like the leadership lesson from there. So.
If you were in our shoes today, a senior looking to apply to jobs with an engineering degree, what would you do? Or something that you would have done differently, maybe?
It's a good question. Okay, so.
Let me repeat
Oh,
it for
yeah,
the
sorry.
recording. Sorry. So the something you would have done differently if you were doing it today?
Okay. So I will